Go ahead.
Okay. So are we, are we going out to everybody now?
Yep, you're good.
1 minute.
Okay, great. So, hey, welcome everybody. This is the first one of these I'm chairing. So apologies for the awkward intro. Thanks everybody for stopping by. We've got some pretty good papers here. We're down one, so we'll have three. We'll run these a little longer. Each presentation will be roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have time afterwards for Q&A. The chat function should be up and running at the moment, and I can hopefully see those. So what I will do is when we get to the Q&A, what I'll do is I'll read questions off and then to whomever they're directed to, and then those folks can answer those questions. So the first paper up. Okay, apparently the chat isn't up. Lauren, is there a way to get the chat functioning?
Yeah, sorry, they asked us to default it to off, but I can put it so everyone can chat.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Okay, I think we'll get going then. The first paper, you get to listen to me talk first. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll pop over there. Okay, so a few things to say about this work before we hop into it. This is really sort of a side project of some work that I did with my research team, as well as some colleagues from the Materials Science Department, both at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and several other UW campuses. The project was originally funded by the Tommy Thompson Leadership Center, which is a public policy, I guess, think tank. And our objective was to identify Wisconsin businesses that could participate in green energy production, particularly in solar and wind, and initially nuclear, although we ended up dropping that from the program. That report is available at the Tommy Thompson Leadership Center site, and is also in the paper, which I'm happy to share with people if they're so interested. So here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, the goal was to try to figure out here, what businesses could really participate, what Wisconsin businesses could participate in nuclear, wind or solar, either production, direct production, or be associated with the supply chain of producing in those areas. Now, as we heard, yesterday in Dr. Robert Loeb's presentation, the cost structure associated with these types of energy productions is changing quite rapidly. It's falling, particularly solar, and this is resulting in fairly rapid alterations to how we're supplying energy. Of course, that's sort of the market forces, right? And then we also, of course, have non-market forces such as climate change that are likely to disrupt this market going forward, and potentially over very short periods of time. So we're possibly in a situation where we could be in a position of having to radically alter supply chains as well as radically alter energy production. Okay. And of course, that would be highly disruptive, not just to the Wisconsin economy.
Excuse me, Professor Kemp. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. My son is here, so he's helping me to download my PPT file. So can you tell him how to do that again?
I really can't because I'm presenting right now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So we're back. So, you know, following the principle of minimal disruption, of course, which has a long history in institutional economics, you know, economists and economics should really seek to mitigate this. And we believe that this work represents, you know, sort of modest contribution to potentially minimizing this structural disruption associated with moving to greener energy production. So to start off, we'll review the structure of the work. In this paper, we first review Wisconsin state manufacturing capacity and resiliency. In other words, to show whether it's a good test bed for this type of work. Second, we discuss the methodology used to identify Wisconsin firms that are well suited and well positioned to make this shift into different production. And third, we discuss the difficulties and uncertainties associated with this process. And then fourth and finally, we suggest changes to data reporting requirements that would make this type of process much, we believe, much easier and would likely significantly reduce social and economic disruption associated with relatively quick structural reform in energy production. Okay, so to start off with, current manufacturing capacity and characteristics of the state of Wisconsin. Now, mind you, the entire methodology of this work is scalable to all 50 United States. The state of Wisconsin was chosen because that was our mandate. Well, that was our mandate in the original study, but there's nothing here that couldn't be done at the national level. Okay, so Wisconsin manufacturing comprises roughly 16% of state employment, so it's significant, right? 10% is the nationwide average. Okay, you can read the rest of them, right? It's 58 billion, 19% of state output. It's the biggest subsector in the state. So although we hear a lot about manufacturing decline in the United States and so on and so forth, it's still incredibly important to the Wisconsin economy. It is also highly diverse, comprising over 200 plus NAICS subsectors. Okay, and so we believe it's a good basis for thinking about national capacities. It's a relatively strong and vibrant sector when compared to the rest of the nation. Now, of course, anybody who's thought about this for a few minutes knows that there's going to be a problem in identifying real capacities. I was frankly a little embarrassed when we started on this project. Material scientists approached me and said, "Here's what we need to do," and they figured, like, of course, us economists must have a way of figuring out exactly how many windmills could be produced in X period of time or whatever, and I had to rather sheepishly tell them that there was really not really any good way to know that, right? Because of course, we have what I'm referring to in the paper is this aluminum ingot problem. Even when we take a sort of very simple thing, like there's almost nothing more boring than a hunk of aluminum, right? Okay, something has gone wrong here. Tech person, Lauren, I'm no longer seeing my own screen. Hey, Brian, can you hear me? Can you stop sharing your screen? Hey, Lauren?
I can't see you either.
Yeah, thanks. Can you guys see me again?
We see you, but not your screen.
Okay. Okay, coming back. Thanks, Greg. Okay, can you see me again?
You're on.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Greg. Okay, so we take the most boring thing like an aluminum ingot, right? It's just a hunk of aluminum. Well, what grade of aluminum, right? Because different types of aluminum can be used for different things. You know, you can't use, if you're going to make an airplane, you need a certain grade of aluminum. If you're going to make a windmill tower, you need a certain grade of aluminum. What's the refining process associated with that? What's the loss rate? So in other words, when you turn the aluminum into the thing, how much of the aluminum do you actually lose? In other words, so you need 5 tons, you need 8 tons, so on and so forth. Long story short, the list of questions is endless, right? It's absolutely endless. And so what we do have in terms of official data is we have the standard industrial classification system, which some years ago, of course, became the North American Industrial Classification System, NAICS, okay? However, in that you're still limited to nominal values, right? It obviously doesn't talk about real output for the reasons that we just discussed. as well as linkages across industries within that system work backwards rather than forwards. That is, we have an idea, we can recreate a production function for X, Y, Z thing that's already being created. But what we can't do is we can't create hypothetical linkages within that system. So we can't essentially say what type of production could be. We can only really say what type of production is, right? And of course, most problematic is we can't get down to the firm level in terms of public data, publicly available data, excuse me. So we need to resort, in our cases, we resorted to private databases, which we'll come back to in just a second. Okay, so to get this job done, the first thing we did is we didn't create, the economists didn't create, but the material scientists created a list of components associated with the production of these things, of solar cells, wind turbines, because we had several conversations about sort of how industrial classification works and how we would go about trying to identify these things. And first of all, we need essentially a laundry list to develop some kind of hypothetical production function. And from that list, we created a master list of Wisconsin industries using census data, business census data, comprising 110,000 firms across 3,000 plus industries. This is Wisconsin only, right? So this is another reason for using Wisconsin only is that the data sets are huge, right? Using the components list for these things, okay, we searched within the NAICS system using a series of keywords, right, to try to figure out from that production list, where did we identify those keywords within the NAICS descriptions, okay? And we were able to identify 3,000 firms across, roughly 25 industries. We then took those 25 NAICS industrial codes, right? So we backed out of where we were with that initial identification and simply went back to the NAICS industrial codes associated with the identified key terms. And we searched a proprietary database. So, and again, I'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, these proprietary databases are problematic for a number of reasons that I'll discuss in just a moment. But within that proprietary database, individual firms were researched to determine. So we actually went in, right? My awesome research team, Megan's below, and we had I think we had about 8 other students working on this, if I remember rightly. Yeah, yes. so I had my students digging through all this proprietary database, looking for firms with the potential to produce output compatible with items or an item on these lists. And so, for example, this entailed, right, going into the proprietary database, identifying the firm, then going to the firm's website and trying to figure out, like, is this going to work, right? And from that, we identified roughly 150 firms from the state, okay, from the state of Wisconsin that we thought were relatively good fit. And at the conclusion of the work, which was this last summer, we actually mailed the report to these 150 firms and had a number of communications with them. Okay, so back to some of the problems. As I mentioned, we had to use these proprietary databases. We used one called A to Z databases, which is the first one listed here on the slide, but there are many, many others of varying quality, including Zoom, Inflow, LinkedIn, Sales Navigator, Lead 411, and so on. There are free versions of most of these, but to get access useful information at the firm level, you need to buy these. Now, fortunately, our local library had access. This was an happy accident that we found this, but our local library had already purchased access to A to Z databases. And so thankfully, a few of us had library cards and we were able to access those. Problems with this is the data is self-reported and without penalty for false reporting, right? So this is just businesses reporting information about their firm to this database to try to capture business, right? And link up with potential suppliers or downstream, people who might purchase the output of their firm. And so there's no hard assurance of veracity as there would be with government data, right? There's no penalty for false reporting. And we found a lot of data, right, that we kind of thought looked pretty sketchy, right? And so it's sort of standard, it's like when we go back in American history, like, why did we create all these public data sets in the first place? Well, So we found that to be the case here. Data is often incomplete as well, right? So there's categories that are missing. That said, they were useful for us, right, to identify firms, and they also contained information that the standard industrial classification system did not, and that's particularly they offered, lists of services offered, right? That is, sort of talking about what's possible. And, this is the problem with, rapid structural change, right? So we think of World War II, Chryslers become B-17 engines and things like that, right? And so if we were to look at an existing supply chain in 1931 for building Chryslers, it wouldn't necessarily become apparent that you could build engines for bombers using those production lines. But if firms are self-reporting the type of services that they're offering, then it becomes easier to start thinking about alternative supply chains. Okay. So these private sector systems are designed to facilitate alternative pairings of firms. Now, we kind of thought of this independently, but the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation had a similar idea, right, for similar reasons, although they weren't thinking about rapid structural change. They're just trying to, lower transactions costs essentially. But they developed a similar, public reporting style system. Although that had limited success because really there's no teeth behind reporting it, and so it had a lot of the same problems, that the data was pretty sloppy and lacking. Okay, so to conclude, hope I'm doing okay on time here. To conclude, we suggest what might be some slight modifications to business census questions. Now, keep in mind that this, as a former regulator myself, I'm always concerned about costs and things like this, but there's already over 20 plus questions that go out in the business census that businesses report. So this is actually a fairly minor modification to what's already done. But we're suggesting, this might be designed about, these additional questions might be designed around what might be rather than what is. And so, maybe a system of products and services offered. Just off the top of my head, we thought maybe like a JEL style system of classification. But again, these are possibilities, not what are. Capacities, workforce capacities, manufacturing capacities, export abilities, transportation requirements, core competencies, and risk mitigation strategies. So essentially 6 additional questions to the 22 that are already in the business census. And these touch upon some of the other issues that we had. So, we've all heard about the Foxconn debacle that's sort of created a lot of problems here in my home state of Wisconsin. They built a whole bunch of new roads for that, and now that factory is not happening. And so there are other concerns besides just even sort of aluminum ingot style problems. There are transportation issues. We've had a lot of problems with that with fracking here in the state and the shifting of that, a lot of more trains on the rails as well as trucks on the road. And then there's a lot of workforce issues too. Like, if you shift from making snowmobiles, let's say, which do have some precision manufacturing, to producing windmill blades, turbine blades, is the workforce capable of doing that, or are there training issues that need to be considered? And I'll just conclude then, because I think I have a few minutes still. I'll conclude then with a sort of interesting side note that really came out of this work. And that's that I'd always been kind of taught growing up that the efforts to mobilize for World War II were sort of easy. And in this research, because one of the first things we did is figure out what did they do during World War II, right? And I learned that actually it was actually quite difficult, and the War Production Board actually had to go out and really drag most manufacturers to wartime production. And then they had needed to continue to modify and refine their processes throughout the war period. Having done this work, I can easily see why that would be. Anyway, I think I've rambled on enough. I'll leave it there. Okay, we'll hold questions to the end. I can't see the chat function right now because I'm in my presentation, but what we'll do is we'll put this one down and okay, is my screen sharing stopped now, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, Dr. Hayden, would you like to have the
I'm
floor?
working on it.
Awesome. Okay, so again, I have the chat function up, so I should be able to see that here if you're chatting in.
Okay, what I'm going to do is use the screen to read. If I can get rid of some of your pictures. Yes, I can. I can see it now. Okay. The purpose of this paper is to explain how the approach taken by Nobel Prize economist William Nordhaus to model the economics of climate change has misled and does not provide relevant policymaking assistance for mitigation. Simply put, his modeling indicates that global warming and climate change are not problems that require policies that would place reducing greenhouse gas emissions primary to economic growth. Or stated differently, when Nordhaus balances the cost to consumption of policies to slow greenhouse gas production against the negative impacts of the greenhouse gas to climate change, maximization of consumption is his standard. Thus, his work has been used by groups opposed to climate change mitigation policy. Additionally, his work has been adversely criticized by economists who stress the need for aggressive mitigation policies, a criticism directed at his numbers while leaving the basic concepts and structure of his analysis intact. The critique here is different. It is to explain why two of his basic concepts are not valid. First is how Nordhaus's work fails to be consistent with the principles of complex systems, and second is how Nordhaus's concept of time is an illusion. Modern science has adopted the principles of complex system. Nordhaus does not. His models are complicated but not complex, as I explained last year. Difference between those two. Nordhaus states that the situation is complex, but he ignores the principles of complex systems in his modeling. Consequently, reality is not modeled. If analysts do not begin with the appropriate philosophical approach, inappropriate model and analysis can be expected. The adoption of the instrumental or pragmatic philosophy would have clarified for Nordhaus that an asserted trajectory overly dependent on a closed mathematical formula is not sufficient for making ongoing judgments and decisions about climate change processes, impacts, and policies. The instrumental philosopher John Dewey explained the importance of decisions coming from reflection about experience. This means that analytical models need to capture the ongoing real-world experience so reflection can be made about a database that reflects the instability and disequilibrium associated with climate change in complex systems. That is not the model of a stable trajectory as generated and discounted by Nordhaus. Such modeling does not allow for the kind of reflection needed to make judgments and decisions about the integrated social, technological, and ecological system, neither about initial projection nor about system changes from the original reality to an alternative reality. Such systems regularly change in ways that do not allow for long-term projections and discounting to describe the present. Modeling made to allow for ongoing data collection about changing reality, as can be made with the social fabric matrix approach, is what is needed. Instead of undertaking modeling like the social fabric matrix, Nordhaus ignored the task of examining societies to find the integration of social beliefs, variant criteria, institutions, attitudes, technology, and ecological systems. Instead, he adopted a narrow part of society, that is the economy, and an economy that for him is narrowly measured with gross GDP as a sufficient base for analysis. Thus, he assumes a world that is separate from rather than embedded in society. Additionally, he asserts that the economy is the result of a market process that is reflected globally by the GDP of all the various countries. Yet economists do not find that countries like Russia, China, Guatemala, Mali, Sweden, and the United States, to mention a few, are market economies. Openness, which is a most important principle for complex systems, is ignored by Nordhaus. A system is surrounded by an outside environment made up of outside systems with which the system receives inputs and delivers outputs. The connected deliveries with the outside systems are unstable because they are not explained by system components. This makes for dynamic instability because real-world systems are constantly open to their environment. Systems cannot reach an equilibrium state. Misspecifications arise when systems are regarded as closed. The major misconception is the failure to recognize fully that the organization is continually dependent upon inputs from the environment and that the inflow of materials and human energy is not a constant. Nordhaus fails to recognize the dependency on the outside environment. Thus, his models, which are expressions of classical mathematics, are closed formulae that reach equilibrium. Therefore, they are misleading to policymakers who must deal with a real world that is open to powerful outside forces. Nordhaus deals with many varied concerns ranging from diarrheal disease to macroeconomics. The trouble arises with the way in which he handles the concerns. He tries to convert them all into a common denominator of monetary cost to consumption when there is no such common denominator. Then he locks the varied concerns into his classical mathematical model. What he does not do is to design his modeling so that it considers the unstable dynamic connections of outside forces so that policy agencies can use the modeling to match mitigation action to changes delivered from the outside systems. Nordhaus's commitment to simplicity is so great that he invents a fake quote for Leonardo da Vinci as an epigraph for one of his books that states, simplicity is the highest form of sophistication. Although climate change analysis is about complex systems, not sophistication, Nordhaus insists on building one-dimensional simplicity into his models. Although the greenhouse gas methane is dangerous, much more powerful than carbon in its capacity to trap heat and it is increasing in quantity. Nordhaus narrows his concern to carbon. He narrows his cost-benefit concerns only to human consumption. That is, he ignores complicity inherent in complex system analysis. Inherent in complex system analysis is the example that different varied parts, attitudes, wildlife, industrial production of systems function differently and are impacted differently by the system and by outside systems. Likewise, climate change impacts are varied, as is the inequality of heat in different locations. Nordhaus simplifies by making consumption the primary concern, stating that, quote, in the model, different models are evaluated on the basis of their contribution to the economic welfare, or more precisely, consumption of different generations. Ignoring the complexity and variety in systems leads to highly aggregated relationships, which he states are motivated by primary concern. The relationships among the different parts of the system are extremely complex, partially because they involve long-term dynamics. It is useful, therefore, to work with a model that is as simple and transparent as possible. Remember, this is his quote: "Complex systems cannot be easily understood, and strange behavior may well arise because of the interaction of complex nonlinear relationships." End quote. He is stating that reality is too complex, dynamic, and difficult to understand with his approach to modeling. Thus, he states that his model, quote, "contains highly simplified representations of the major relationships among emissions, concentrations, climate change, the cost of emissions reductions, and the impact of climate change. Much regional detail is hidden or lost in the aggregation, and some of the trade-offs involved, particularly between rich and poor regions, cannot be explored." End quote. A different approach to integrating modeling is needed, one that does not simplify the differentiation of various parts and the dynamic functions among the parts. The social fabric matrix approach is an integrated system needed to recognize the heterogeneity of people, organizations, species, and economies that are in complex dynamic systems. A serious adverse consequence of his commitment to simplicity is the one-dimensional advice emanating from his model regarding mitigation policy. For international agreements, Nordhaus insists that, quote, carbon prices should be equalized in every sector and in every country, and they are to be harmonized across sectors and countries so that there are not exemptions or favored sectors, and there is to be complete participation. The concerns about participation apply within as well as across countries. End quote. Political science and real-world policymaking clarify that this kind of simple one-dimensional policy pronouncement is not helpful. Costs and participation were not the same among the Allied countries in World War II. It cannot be expected, it should not be expected, and it will not happen with regard to global collaboration for greenhouse gas mitigation policy. Thus, complex system modeling is needed to insist in determining what kind of different carbon prices ought to be delivered in different areas in different countries. Nordhaus also adopts the ideological claim that GDP is a measure of the production of goods and services without a recognition that much of the production and consumption includes bads and disservices. We'll call them bads. Ignoring bads leads to some of Nordhaus's major mistakes. First, the assumption that some production is better than less production, or more production is better than less production, even when it is bads, many of which generate greenhouse gas. Second, and related to the first, by counting all human consumption and its consequences as bad, Nordhaus has consequently regularly referred to global warming and climate change as a global public good. This makes it impossible to use Nordhaus's modeling to know which bads productions to decrease by how much in order to decrease greenhouse gas. Third, he explains that climate change generates benefits because the expenses incurred to deal with the consequences of climate change are an expenditure that increases GDP. Thus, the more greenhouse gas, the greater the GDP. When we look out on the real world, there's a set of ongoing production that is considered bad. A few examples are, I give a whole list, from soft drinks to child prostitution, and so on. Of course, some in the list are worse than others, and some could not be eliminated entirely. Which ones and by how much are not questions that can even be considered with the Nordhaus approach. In his analysis, they are all good because they are all part of GDP and therefore are all directly or indirectly part of human consumption. Nordhaus views, quote, the economics of climate change from the perspective that economies make investments today in order to increase consumption in the future, end quote. Thus, he finds that with regard to policy decisions, we should err on the side of too much greenhouse gas production in order to keep as many bads, which are included in GDP, being produced as possible. Or as he states, investments to improve climate need to compete with other, quote, viable investments in terms of pecuniary rate of return. However, many investments are not valuable. Some are for bads. Throughout Nordhaus's publications are phrases such as in time, over time, through time, and across time, as if there is a passing time stream we're in, go over, or transverse, or through and across. However, that concept of time is an illusion based on the experience of perceiving sequence of events. The illusion is magnified when Nordhaus spatializes time with concepts like time horizon, time path, time step, and railroad track, and when he looks across time with a telescope. Time spatialization causes Nordhaus to assume a time stream flowing outward into the future over space and time.
Greg, about 5 minutes.
All right.
Thanks.
After assuming a time stream and spatialization illusion, Nordhaus borrows the geometric mean concept from mathematics to arrive at the present value of money and monetary costs and benefits which he has projected into his time stream. There are numerous invalid premises and assumptions contained in this discounting approach to making calculations for decision making about program selection that are not consistent with modern science. I explained 24 of those in my book in 2006. Scientific knowledge from physics and anthropology clarifies why the Newtonian ideas utilized in time stream discounting are not valid. Carlo Roehl presents one of the clearest explanations about why time does not exist in physics. He states that the Newtonian concepts about time that are now rejected are singularity, direction, independence, and continuity. In physics, the fundamental equations do not include a time variable, but they do include variables that change in relation to each other. Physics has not found that things evolve in time. Thus, what we need if we want to do science is a theory that tells us how the variables change with respect to each other. The fundamental theory of the world must be constructed in this way. It does not need a time variable. For about a century, anthropology textbooks have explained that since there is no universal time in reality, the evolution of time concepts of different societies are very different. Anthropologists have found temporal relations in societies differing from those of other societies in significant ways. This is as should be expected because there is no common base for time in the physical world to which different societies could be coordinating. Instead, they create temporal concepts from the perception about their own sequence of social events and categories. Therefore, people from different cultures have very different concepts of time. Thus, the sciences of the physical world and social world have found there is no time out there as asserted by Nordhaus. This means when Nordhaus writes about the value of time, he is assuming it is possible to find value in illusion. He has stated that time discounting is the most important conceptual issue in his work Therefore, his work does not provide knowledge useful for climate change mitigation. Numerical findings are not relevant when the paradigm for analysis is unfounded. Many critics have disagreed with Nordhaus because its conclusions do not emphasize the need for bold policy. For example, some would disagree with the discount rate that he used in his formula. However, since they accept the discounting as appropriate, they should just change the discount rate. They don't, so they have the same problem he does. Nordhaus's voluminous work demonstrates a case in which an analyst possesses a large body of knowledge about a problem and completes an immense amount of work that generates findings that are at best of little use in solving the problem and at worst misleading to policymakers. That is the case with his work on climate change because the beliefs of his neoclassical ideology led him to adopt misassumptions and illusions about complex systems and time rather than be guided by problem elaboration. Dewey taught us that research is to be guided by the problem at hand and proceed with elaboration in a real-world complex. That is the reason the social fabric matrix approach is recommended. It was developed to define complex systems and to offer relevant policy to mitigate problems consistent with the problem. Nordhaus contrasts bottom-up with top-down modeling and argues for the latter. Neither spatial analogy is helpful. Societal systems do not begin at a base and reach up, nor do they begin at a high level and reach down, and neither should research about them. They process. Societal systems are ongoing, not going on a time track. They are integrated social, technological, and ecological networks that continue to process with occasional evolutionary changes. As explained above, research about them should begin with a problem and without closed models and discounting of a time illusion. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Brian, are you ready? Brian? Okay, well, I'll wait for Brian to chime in.
There he
hang
is.
on. Okay, all right, looks like we're good to go. It's 20 minutes, Brian.
So can I start right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. My paper title is Institutional Failure and Sustainability. And you know, I normally ask my student to make the pronunciation sustainability for extra credit. Okay, so sustainability or sustainability. So in this paper, I will describe second session institutional failure, third session on Professor Meadows' institutional analysis. And then the fourth session, I will describe the institutional significance of sustainability policy and then a short conclusion. Well, I will just skip the introduction part. So now Professor Hayden already provide a very critical analysis for Nordhaus academic work. But I guess the key point is that climate change is a key issue. So I guess that's why reason he got Nobel Prize in 2018. And I also agree with Professor Hayden analysis about Nordhaus work. But if we look at the 2030 agenda, the UN Sustainable Development Goal 13 states that we should take urgent action to combat climate change. So obviously this is the key issue. But here I would like to emphasize is this. From my paper, I would like to say that the nature of climate change, in fact, is more a consequence of chronic institutional failure than an economic issue resulting from environmental externality. We institutional economics or economists frequently criticize the mainstream economists because they did not pay much attention to human institution. So this is not right. But I guess in some sense I would say to some extent many economists, including some institutional economists, not all, some, they do not regard the natural environment as a built-in institution of society. Okay, so I guess we should try to regard the natural environment as a built-in institution of society. But without doing that, I guess we can see right now we face the situation of climate change. So then I would say the rising global mean temperature is a permanent shock to human society. Well, so that's a unexpected consequence right now at this moment. And also we can see that we made a lot of institutions, so many institutions, organizations in the world. But I would say even those institutions, they are legitimized by market and the government, but they are not compatible with the natural institution. They have been embedded for sustained biodiversity in the long run. And now this is another issue. So right now we are facing the coronavirus disease. Well, in Taiwan we are just fine, but right now we are kind of isolated. So so I want to make apology again because in Taiwan I never use online courses. So and also the use of a room is prohibited in Taiwan for classroom use. So this is the first time I use the room. So sorry for my delay. But here I would like to mention
Brian, you seem to have frozen up.
sorry, I cannot hear you.
I think you're good now. You can keep going.
Okay, thank you. So climate change and the COVID-19, I think they both exhibit characteristics of institutional failure. So to a great extent, there's a serious scenario characterized by government failure and the market failure. And also, I would like to mention that multinational corporation. Well, we can find that many giant multinational corporations, they have not only been reluctant to release information about climate change. But they also fail to predict the economic consequence of the outbreak of COVID-19 in early 2020. Okay, so I think many multinational corporations, they fail. We might say that's not their responsibility, but I guess they have the responsibility to release reliable, predictable information for stakeholders. And then it's a Professor Garamido Asia drama. Well, that's finished in 1968, so long time ago. And it's a 3-volume. So I guess many institutional economy already read this book. So I will not review this book in great detail. But my point is that according to Professor Miyado, economic planning in Southeast Asia country was quite different from the Western world. So that means, according to Professor Miyado, South Asia planning has been programmatic. So so that means economic planning in South Asia countries should be comprehensive and complete, not partial and piecemeal. And also, he classified social system into the following 6 categories: output, income, condition of production, level of living, attitude, institution, and policy. But I guess the most important part is that according to Professor Miyado, he mentioned that all the 6 conditions, they are causally interrelated, and economic conditions do not have precedence over the other. A change in the condition in the direction of a greater desirability from the viewpoint of a development can be termed as a change upward. So the basic point is that Professor Miyado takes the whole social system as a holistic system, and then development means an improvement in the host of undesirable condition in the social system. So that's the movement of the whole social system upward. So I guess that's very important. But later on, we have the so-called the ASEAN +3. So the original 10 countries with addition of Japan, South Korea, and China. So that's called ASEAN +3. And now if we look the history of ASEAN +3, we can see that the ASEAN 3 or the ASEAN way actually is a gradual process through which multilateral interaction take place, and this involves a high degree of the so-called it's actually a lengthy process of a negotiation and consensus building. And then actually the ASEAN member country did not develop any formal agenda or specific formula for promoting the Bangkok Declaration in the 1970s and 1980s. So the point here I want to emphasize is the emergency of Asian regional planning has been driven by an implicit process of a multilateral interaction and a negotiation, rather than an orientation of an explicit or specific goal. So there's a lengthy process of a multilateral interaction and a negotiation. And then, but the very interesting I want to mention here is that if we look goal 13 for climate change, at this point, it remains unclear what specific value goal 13 will create for global climate governance, especially for the ASEAN country. So, so far the ASEAN country have not yet to take any action for climate change. The only exception is Singapore.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And then if we look Thailand, it's very interesting. Thailand has assigned the UN 17 goal between 1 and 3 corresponding ministry of all government agency for further consideration. So as a result, that goal from 12 to 15, including goal 13, have been assigned to Thailand Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. But the vision for this ministry actually is to balance and sustain natural resources and the environment within 2037. And then let's take goal A, for example. Goal A looks very good. Promote, sustain, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth for and productive unemployment and decent work for all. So that's the UN goal A. But the reality is that half of the ASEAN countries they can only report partial and incomplete information regarding the annual growth rate of real GDP for per worker between 2016 to 2018. Okay, data is incomplete. And also, if we look at UN has yet to offer clear indicator for monitoring the various targets. For example, target 8.4 is very good, but the target 8.4 is to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. But the UN has not yet to tell us what kind of indicator to monitor target 8.4 except GDP. Okay, so that's here I just want to emphasize sustainability policy. So let me take 3 minutes to finish this. So from my perspective, each of the UN SDG actually must be framed and implemented as a national goal from the beginning. The ASEAN country actually they are not developed economy. The exception is Singapore. So any stray alignment with the UN SDG are not feasible without further change in the socio-economic structure of the ASEAN country. So I think what the ASEAN country they really need to do is first to initiate a comprehensive sustainability policy for each country in the first place. And then, so what is a sustainability policy? Well, compared with the intervention of a stabilization policy, the Keynesian stabilization policy in the economy in the short run, a sustainability policy here refers to a process of institutional planning for achieving multi-goal at a national level in the long run. Okay, so let me A sustainability policy here refers to a process of institutional planning for achieving multi-goal at the national level in the long run. So to do this, we need first, the coordination of a bundle of policy measures, and then B, an adjustment of a socio-economic institution for aligning policy measures from the short term to the long term.
1 minute.
How many
1
minutes
minute.
left?
Brian.
Okay, thank you. No problem. So, so from the perspective of achieving sustainability agenda, the institutional limitation of a macroeconomic stabilization policy should be pointed out. There is a stabilizing policy normally isolate economic facts from other issues and primarily focus on short-term economic activity. So I think it has become increasingly clear that a stabilization policy is necessary for running the economy in the short run, but it's not sufficient for promoting society as a whole in the long run. Finally, so to satisfy a national agenda with an emphasis on sustainability that is compatible with global sustainability, it is crucial for countries to implement not only short-run stabilization policy, but also a long-run sustainability policy as well. So, so thank you. Happy New Year. So that's my final conclusion. Only when each country clearly chooses its own national agenda on sustainability, so can the sustainability SDG goal at the regional or global level be further negotiated and aligned. So thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so as I mentioned, Brian, can you hit the screen, stop screen sharing there on the top?
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, there we go.
You.
There we go.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not sure what everybody's seeing. Okay. So as I mentioned, we only had 3 papers on this panel. Unfortunately, the 4th panelist was not able to present. So we do have the remaining time for Q&A. Lauren, are you still there with us?
I am here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all your assistance during this. You know, we only have a handful of people here. Is it possible to let everybody be on screen at once to discuss, or is that not possible at this juncture?
I don't think they set it up to do that. Let me see if I can work around it.
And everybody else, while Lauren is working on that, if you have questions for any of the presenters, please, you can enter those in either the chat or the Q&A. I have both of them open here, as well as I'm trying to scan the sort of hand function here. So I'm looking at all 3 things at once in addition to monitoring us. But if you have any questions, please, I think maybe the Q&A is the easiest to see, or the chat function is the easiest to see. And I can certainly, in the format now, allow people to talk too.
Yeah, sorry, it won't let me override.
Yeah, I kind of suspect. I think that's the whole meeting versus webinar thing, right?
Yeah.
All right. There were a couple questions during the presentations that I answered. Anybody? Sorry, this is a challenge. This is because I can't see what anybody's doing or thinking. I'm sort of talking to myself in an empty room here.
I see the one question to you and Megan.
Yeah.
It looks like you answered that. Do you want to read that and go over the answer for the audience?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good idea.
They can't read the chat, I don't
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, well, Brent, are you out there? If so, if you want to let me know if you want to read it out. Otherwise, I'll read it out. So I'm going to kind of give a second here. All right. So Dr. Brent McClintock asked of Megan's and my paper earlier on. The work on assessing flexibility of the supply chain was very much needed in response to COVID. Yes, absolutely. There was a lot of reporting in Wisconsin and elsewhere how manufacturers switched production to PPE, ventilators, etc. So as part of prep for a natural disaster, this sort of tracking of supply chain flexibility is valuable. I hope someone notices this for future needs. There may be projects in trawling back through the news and business reports within Wisconsin, for example, to see how business, hospitals, etc., coordinated to change production during a health emergency. Yeah, absolutely. So funny thing about our project, I guess, is that we actually started this project 1.5 years ago. And most of the work was done ahead of COVID. We actually had anticipated, we wanted to do nuclear as well. And then we were actually going to go out and talk to these manufacturers about this and how they thought maybe we could better develop this. But then COVID hit come spring, and we all kind of had to bottle up. And not only that, but we had to wrap up this report very quickly because well, for a couple of reasons, COVID being one of them, but funding and stuff being another reason. But yeah, COVID absolutely, is kind of worked into the paper a little bit. And again, I'm happy to share those. My contact information was on the last slide, but you can find me at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Happy to share a copy of the paper with anybody who's interested. But yeah, we didn't really have much of a chance to work all the COVID stuff into there. So I'm actually hoping to put together a second paper on, because this World War II story is super fascinating to me too, right? And that's another thing that I would, most of that stuff is not digitized. Like most of those documents are not digitized yet. And which I didn't know, right, until I started looking for them. And I'm like, oh, so the library's closed, so I can't go down to the stacks to get them all. But it's my intention to go back and dig through all these war production documents, war production board documents, and then talk about how they did this and then sort of what that might mean for COVID. Now, I'm not sure if I can do that in a timely manner, because probably by the time I can get to the library, COVID's over. Hopefully. But that's a super interesting thing, right? And now we're unfortunately seeing more sort of calamity with the rollout of vaccine. That boy, you would think that we could have done this better, but here we are, and I just don't know what to say. So yeah, much appreciated that question. It's super pertinent. Any other questions?
I have a couple of comments.
All right.
If no one has questions. I didn't think about the World War II example when I read your paper, but it reminded me when I was in basic training in the Army, they gave us old rifles for basic training. Mine was from World War II, and it was built by John Deere tractor. It's stamped right on there. So we've done this before. With regard to Thomas and Megan, I would hope you'd continue this work. It's very important. I think there may be less than minimal disruption, because we're going to need to move on this fairly rapidly. Maybe we won't, but we should. And what I would suggest is you start building in the greenhouse gas emissions from each of these industries. And then you can start making decisions with regard to trade-offs if we shut this one down versus if we shut this one down. And once again, I'm thinking World War II, my father signed up to go to war and they wouldn't let him because he was a farmer. In other words, they knew those industries needed to keep going, especially for the butter and the lard from the cows and the hogs to make explosives. And so I would really emphasize that. Beyond that, you mentioned something about not being able to get information about companies that produce, for example, wind generators and the big stacks they go on and so on. We do that in the United States. Now, Lincoln Electric in Cleveland produces those. And so I would say if you look in some other states, I don't know, maybe they don't produce any of those in Wisconsin, but if you look in other states, I think you'll get information there. And something that I've never seen that I assume someone has done is what are the greenhouse emissions from the production of those? And what are the greenhouse emissions from the production of solar panels and so on? I can't help but think that has been done. But I think my main advice is to build the greenhouse emissions into the industries that you're working on. Now, I would say in passing that that's something that came to my mind when I read, I think, your first paragraph when you talked about hydro, that is water power, and non-hydro power. I couldn't help but think of Robert Owen when he and his business partner wrote about testing those very things and testing them with regard to horsepower. And so I don't know if you want to bring in horses. If you move globally, you will. You bring in lots of donkeys, but we're kind of back where Robert Owen was a long time ago. Brian.
Yeah.
Expand on those goals. That's to me the main part of your paper. I would say in terms of the social fabric matrix, you bring in Myrdal's categories of your main institutions, and then you refine those goals down into social criteria. And that's something we just, need in so many ways in this area is, well, what are those belief criteria we're going to use in order to undertake the full analysis to know how in the world we're going to move on this. The only other thing I'd say is something that came up between both of your papers together was I've never thought about the connection between institutional failure and mental dislocation. And so that might be something we'd all think about in the future.
Okay, yeah, yes. Yeah.
I'm done.
Thanks, Greg, for those comments. Yeah, I know the horsepower thing, right? That's for sure. Well, so Dr. Kathy Foreman asked another question in the chat here, and I hope it's okay with her. I'm just going to talk about that quickly. So she says, Dan Goldstein from Allegheny College noted his talk on a regional-based strategy for the Green New Deal that businesses and organized labor in Northwestern Pennsylvania were reluctant to engage in a regional strategy because they were focused on individual global markets. Any thoughts, problems in Wisconsin? Yeah, I mean, our sampling is really poor, right? Because we were mailing these all out to businesses, in the middle of COVID, right? So everybody is kind of crisis mode. It was July when we were sending these final reports out to everybody. But we did get response from a surprising number of businesses, right? And they were all positive and like really positive. Like they were excited about this, and they you know, they were happy that somebody was reporting on the work they were doing, because they, you know, they all kind of felt like, oh my gosh, you know, we're out here making solar panel parts and nobody knows it, and you know, we're happy for the press, right? And you know, so on and so forth. So far the experience has been very positive, and in fact I'm trying to think, I don't want to get in too deep into the weeds, right? But we had businesses contact that we did not identify too, because we got a lot of press over this. We got you know, we had an hour-long interview on Wisconsin Public Radio that went statewide. And so we ended up having a lot of firms contact us and be like, hey, you know, I do this cool stuff too. You should have, you know, why am I not in your report? So far, it's been extremely positive, thankfully. And I was, you know, pleasantly surprised. You know, Wisconsin's kind of an old school state, and but no, people were excited, thankfully, about these possibilities. Sorry, I'm running back and forth between too many panels here. I think I've got, if there's a question and I haven't got it or haven't discussed it. Oh, hang on, here we go. Okay, so thanks, Kathy. Sorry, I just saw your response now. Yeah. Any other questions or comments for any of the presenters? Okay, well, you know, of course we are over the middle of lunch here, and I'm always a little worried when I see that my panel is at lunchtime, because you know how that goes. So I think, you know, maybe we can call it a day, and of course, if people want to contact any of the presenters, I can provide contact information if you email me, or of course contacting them directly also works. Thanks everybody for being here today, and we'll hope to see everybody in more panels for the remainder of the conference. So with that, Lauren, if it's okay with you, I think I'm gonna end the, well, I guess I don't have the power to end this, but I'll leave it.
Yep, no, I'll take care of it. Everyone have a good day.
All right, thanks everybody. Cheers.
Yeah, from Taiwan.